Hello, my name is Michelle Minton. I'm a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a think tank in the United States, and I'm going to be talking about the benefits of nicotine. Now, I know my distinguished fellow panelists are going to be speaking about some of the benefits from a clinical perspective, but I've been asked to talk about something a little bit different, which is the pleasure that people derive from nicotine as a benefit. Briefly, I'll talk about what pleasure is, then I'll discuss why that matters for our health. And then finally, I'm going to talk about nicotine, the pleasure we get from it, and the role that it might have as a sort of folk medicine and why it's been ignored, why the uses of nicotine, the pleasure, have been ignored largely by medicine and science. So when we talk about pleasure, I think most of us have an idea of what that means, but I want to be clear that when I'm talking about it here, it isn't just referring to hedonism or just the physical pleasant sensations, but I'm talking about pleasure in one's life, a much broader idea, which is the combination of the physiological, the psychological or positive mood, and then the emotional, so a sense of looking at your life and being happy with it or satisfied. And a bunch of different words that can describe these concepts like happiness or joy, satisfaction, contentedness. And they're very personal too, right? So if you're talking about looking at your life and saying, I'm happy with this, one person may care more about their family or community connections, whereas another might care more about advancing their career or feeling like they're fulfilling their purpose in life. So does pleasure matter? And I mean specifically with regard to our health. The answer is yes, because pleasure is a primary component of well-being. Well-being isn't just the absence of pain or suffering. It is positive as well. It is both, sustained lack of suffering, but also a sense of joy and comfort, health, and happiness. Right? So it's negative and positive, not suffering and joy. And when it comes to well-being, there is a lot of evidence about the effect that that has, about perceived sense of well-being on actual physical health outcomes. People who rate their happiness or well-being higher tend to live healthier lifestyles, which has a lot of impacts. They also tend to have lower stress. Being a happier mood can boost immunity. It has cardiovascular benefits, and people who rate their happiness higher or their well-being higher seem to live longer and more satisfying lives. So now that we've established that pleasure impacts well-being and well-being has impacts on human health, let's talk a little about the role of nicotine, its pleasure, and human health. I know some people will say that the only pleasure people get from nicotine is that it prevents withdrawal cravings, for example. And I use negative here in terms of taking away. So nicotine takes away cravings. But we know it does more than that. It also relieves pain, it reduces stress, and it has anti-inflammatory effects. We also know that it has some positive aspects, some additive benefits, and it can elevate mood, which I know Dr. Paul Newhouse has done some work on that. Nicotine also causes relaxation and improved cognition. Now, well, some of us might just be getting familiar with some of the potential benefits of nicotine. The use of nicotine, or more specifically tobacco, in traditional medicine has an extremely long and wide history throughout the world. Tobacco has been used as a key ingredient in traditional remedies, therapies, and ceremonies. And I know you probably can't read the words on the screen too much, but that's just a collection of some of the traditional uses of tobacco/nicotine throughout history. Tobacco was so widely used in traditional medicine that it led one medical historian, the late Anne Charlton, to say that too much was expected of tobacco by medieval times. Most herbs, even in traditional therapies, were used for only a few conditions, whereas tobacco seemed to be applied to a huge range of conditions and diseases. The funny thing about that is, though, as research has looked into nicotine or different types of tobacco used in traditional medicine, they're finding that a lot of the therapies and the remedies of traditional medicine have some basis in science, like a poultice of tobacco leaf for wound healing or its antibacterial effects, or the use of tobacco for inflammatory diseases like eczema, which now we have pharmaceutical companies or other types of companies using this ingredient nicotine to make pharmaceutical products to solve the same problems that traditional healers were using tobacco for hundreds of years ago. even as traditional use for hair loss or hair growth was something that came up a few times, so I had to look into it, and sure enough, it turns out, based on modern science, this may have a basis. So the more research that's done, the more it seems that nicotine derived from tobacco, as traditional healers used to believe, is a very powerful potential treatment for a range of conditions. So the question is, why is this research only beginning now, really in earnest, beginning now to look at nicotine as a therapeutic when traditional healers have been using it for many, many generations, for hundreds of years? And I think some of the reasons are obvious. Smoking is harmful to health. Tobacco use is controversial, and therefore nicotine, which is so closely associated with tobacco, is also controversial. So it doesn't get as much attention as for its potential benefits. But I think there's a subtler reason why the benefits of nicotine have been ignored. And that's because it's transgressive, particularly the way it was used in traditional therapies. Traditional medicine is always transgressive towards the authority. But I think even the modern use of non-combustible nicotine is transgressive, and it's perceived by Western medical authorities as something of a threat. So very briefly, I want to delve into what the Western biomedical approach actually is, what these Western medical authorities are. And they have a very particular approach. I mean, we can call this global public health because Western medicine is global public health at this point. And typically it is objective. They see a universalizable truth that can be found and applied universally. It's disintegrative or deconstructive. Think about the body parts organizations. They look at the heart, they look at the lungs. It's also top down. They are the authority. They give you the medicine or the protocol of the therapy. And therefore it's authority driven and also authority empowering. Whereas on the other hand, traditional medicine is a little bit more subjective. It's based on the perceptions of the patients. It's holistic or pluralistic. Patients aren't necessarily expected to only see one shaman. It's interpersonal. The relationship between the shaman or the healer and the patient is very important. It's also individual community driven. The knowledge often arises from the individual themselves or the community, and it's individual community empowering. That is, it's directed by individuals, so they have the power to decide how their treatment goes forward if they seek other treatments. I think these quotes from Richard Keller in his paper Geographies of Power describes the Western medical approach, particularly the global public health approach, pretty well, which is this idea that they see themselves as the gatekeepers of scientific and medical knowledge. They see the body, the annexation of its parts, as their rightful dominion, and any challenge to that, any attempt to negotiate the protocols or find a different way is seen as a threat, and folk knowledge itself is seen as a threat to the Western medical establishment's authority. So sometimes, eventually, traditional therapies, traditional medicines, herbal medicine, whatever you want to call it, gets enough attention from Western researchers and eventually, maybe, makes it past the gates and becomes part of the sanctioned Western medical approach. For example, there are a ton of herbal remedies that have been used by tribal peoples for hundreds of years that have been researched and processed into powerful pharmaceuticals that are used for a host of diseases and conditions that in a very meaningful way, have saved lives. I think cannabis is another really good example where for a very long time, for many decades in fact, it was seen as nothing more than a drug of abuse, but is now gaining wide acceptance for its powerful therapeutic benefits. And others that are still in the process are things like ayahuasca or magic mushrooms for psychological conditions. And I think with nicotine, we're starting to see some of the research pick up, but it still hasn't been sanctioned yet. Even things that were once considered hocus pocus or trickery are starting to gain some acceptance by Western medicine. Things like meditation or mindfulness is what they call it, or even the placebo effect. So none of this is to say, to be very clear, that there's no value in modern medicine and Western medicine, not to discount its extreme importance in treating disease. Nor am I trying to say that traditional medicine has all of the answers to health and wellness. It's only to say that neither does Western medicine. No doctor, no shaman, no outside authority can really give us the key to our own wellness because, as I talked about in the beginning, it's highly personal, and it's something that we decide, we perceive based on our own values and our own experience. And that's the Pandora's box that was mentioned in the image of the previous slide for Western medicine, which is that more and more the evidence seems to be accumulating that medicine isn't just about the chemical composition of drugs or the protocols of a specific treatment. More and more, it seems that the effectiveness of medicine, and maybe even what counts as medicine itself, is deeply influenced by context, by the patient's unique makeup, by their life experience, and even their beliefs. So your doctor is never going to prescribe a regimen of sharing a bottle of wine with friends once a month or ordering your spouse to make you a bowl of chicken noodle soup if you catch a cold. But these behaviors can and do have very real health influencing therapeutic value, and there's even research, Western scientific research about these things. And so this brings me back to nicotine, which I think with all of this in mind, we can kind of see as a sort of folk remedy or folk treatment. It was created outside of the medical establishment, and people are coming to it outside of the medical establishment. And the medical establishment only sanctions nicotine for two distinct, completely separate purposes. One, and begrudgingly, they sanction it as a deadly recreational habit, so smoking combustible tobacco, or as a therapeutic product to treat a disease or condition like smoking, so for smoking cessation. But the way people are using novel non-combustible nicotine products is different. Even if it's a product that's sanctioned, they are using it in an unsanctioned way because it does both. It is both pleasurable to vape or use snus or heated tobacco, and people derive perceived health benefits from it, whether that's physical, psychological, or behavioral, such as smoking cessation. And I think perhaps that combined use, that pleasure and the benefits and the fact that it's unsanctioned, might be exactly why these products work so well, because they're pleasurable and because they're unsanctioned. What that does is it gives the people who use these products something that no doctor, no pharmaceutical company, and not even a shaman can give them, which is control over how they pursue their own health and wellness. They are doing it because they get benefits from it, because they enjoy it, because they think it's good for them, not because any authority told them to do so. And that sense of empowerment, that control over one's own life and well-being, in and of itself appears to have powerful benefits for health and improved health outcomes. So I think that's probably one of the reasons that Western medical establishment sees the increasing use of these products as such a threat. Because what's actually happening, what products like e-cigarettes or snus or heated tobacco products represent, is a taking away of some of the power that they have accumulated over the decades and giving it back to the people, giving it back to individuals to make their own choices, to say what works for them on their own without some external validation. And Western medical authorities may see that as a threat, but I think that very well may be one of nicotine's greatest benefits. So even in the very unlikely event that Western medicine never does sanction nicotine for all of these many uses, or never sanctions non-combustible nicotine products because they're pleasurable, I think the damage has already been done. The gates have been broken open, and people now realize that public health experts, for example, don't have all the answers, and I think that's a good thing, frankly. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you all at the conference in Poland.